Resorts International Hotel opened on May 26, 1978, as the first legal casino in Atlantic City and the first legal casino east of the Mississippi River. The opening produced a queue of gamblers that stretched for blocks along the boardwalk, a line of people willing to wait for hours in order to be among the first to gamble legally in a state that had approved casino gaming 2 years earlier as a mechanism for the economic revitalization of a declining resort city. The first day's revenue exceeded projections by a margin that established Atlantic City's potential as a gaming market in terms that no skeptic could dismiss. Resorts International had not merely opened a casino, it had established a market. The company had been founded by James Crosby, a Miami businessman whose earlier ventures had included a Bahamas resort operation that had taught him the economics of destination gaming before the New Jersey opportunity materialized. Crosby had navigated the New Jersey gaming licensing process, assembled the financing for the Atlantic City property, and built the first East Coast casino operation with a combination of regulatory persistence, financial creativity, and the specific competitive advantage of having no competition at all for the first 18 months of the Atlantic City market's existence. The monopoly that the New Jersey licensing timeline had accidentally created made Resorts International the most profitable gaming operation in the world during those 18 months, generating returns that no subsequent Atlantic City casino, in any market condition, would replicate at the same ratio of revenue to investment. James Crosby died in April 1986. The succession dispute that followed his death between his chosen successor, Merv Griffin, and the Crosby family's own estate management produced one of the most precisely documented cases of a family business governance failure in the history of American gaming. A contest for control of a company that had been built by a single founder, whose death had not been accompanied by an adequate succession plan. The forensic entry point for this case is the relationship between founder dependency and institutional durability, because Resorts International documents the proposition that a company built around a single founder's vision, relationships, and decision-making authority can be irreparably damaged by that founder's absence, even when the underlying business is commercially viable. If this is your first case file from this channel, subscribe now, because every episode adds one more layer to what you are about to understand about the architecture of institutional failure. James Crosby had built Resorts International's competitive position in Atlantic City through a combination of first-mover advantage, regulatory relationships, and the specific operational knowledge that his Bahamas gaming experience had provided. The company's Atlantic City property had been constructed on the site of the former Haddon Hall Hotel, a historic boardwalk property whose bones and location Crosby had identified as the optimal foundation for the first Atlantic City casino, a judgment that the property's 18-month monopoly performance had validated comprehensively. The company's board of directors and its institutional shareholders had been comfortable deferring to Crosby's judgment on strategic and operational decisions because his track record had justified that deference repeatedly. The covenant that Resorts International's governance structure did not contain was the one requiring the company to develop a succession plan that could function without Crosby's personal authority and relationships. Crosby had not identified a successor with his combination of regulatory credibility, operational knowledge, and financial relationships. He had not created a governance structure that would prevent the Crosby family estate from contesting strategic decisions that competing parties in the succession wanted to make, and he had not established the institutional independence from his personal authority that would have allowed the company to evaluate competing strategic proposals on their merits rather than as proxies in a succession dispute whose underlying subject was control of the founder's legacy. The succession dispute that emerged after Crosby's death involved Merv Griffin, the television personality and entertainment entrepreneur whom Crosby had reportedly favored as a strategic partner, and the Crosby family interests, whose estate management had a different assessment of the company's strategic direction and the appropriate price for any transaction involving the company's properties. Griffin's bid for Resorts International produced one of the most public and most extensively reported hostile acquisition processes in the history of Atlantic City gaming. involving competing tender offers, board disputes, regulatory interventions by the New Jersey Casino Control Commission, and a litigation record that documented the governance failure at the center of the succession dispute with more specificity than the parties involved would have preferred. The company that had opened the most profitable casino in the world in 1978 was being fought over in public in 1988. At what point does a founder's failure to plan for succession become an act of institutional negligence toward the employees, shareholders, and community whose interests the company served? Leave your analysis in the comments below. The appraisal methodology that governed the competing bids for Resorts International produced valuations that reflected the specific characteristics of the late 1980s Atlantic City gaming market rather than the long-term sustainable earnings of the individual assets being acquired. The Atlantic City gaming market in 1988 was at an inflection point whose direction the competing bidders assessed differently. The bullish assessment treated the Atlantic City market as a growing destination gaming economy whose revenue growth trajectory justified premium valuations for the existing casino properties, particularly for Resorts International, which retained the boardwalk location, the operational infrastructure, and the regulatory relationships that the founder had assembled. The bearish assessment, which subsequent events validated, treated the Atlantic City market as a competitive market whose revenue pool was being divided among an increasing number of properties without the overall growth that would have made premium valuations sustainable across all the competing bids. Simultaneously, the Merv Griffin acquisition of Resorts International, which was completed in 1988 at a price that reflected the bullish assessment, produced a debt structure whose service requirements were calibrated to the revenue growth trajectory that the bullish assessment projected and that the Atlantic City market of the early 1990s did not deliver. The forensic parallel with the Trump Taj Mahal case, documented in Case File 014, is precise. Both transactions involved acquisitions of Atlantic City casino assets in the late 1980s at prices reflecting peak market projections that the early 1990s recession and the simultaneous opening of multiple competing properties made unachievable. Both transactions produced Chapter 11 proceedings. The Griffin-era Resorts International filed for bankruptcy protection in 1994. Having operated the Atlantic City property for 6 years under a debt structure that the market conditions of those 6 years had never validated. The property that had generated monopoly returns in 1978 and 1979 was generating post-bankruptcy restructuring proceedings in 1994. Not because the property's competitive position had been destroyed, but because the acquisition price and debt structure of 1988 had been sized to a market that the Atlantic City of the early 1990s was not. The appraisal failure was not unique to Resorts International. It was the standard failure of the Atlantic City acquisition market at peak cycle. If the forensic analysis this channel conducts is changing how you read real estate headlines, the like button is how the algorithm knows to send this case file to the next analyst who needs it. Merv Griffin's public persona as an entertainer and television personality, which had made him one of the most recognizable figures in American entertainment culture, produced a specific dimension of the Resorts International story that no other case file in this channel's archive has documented. The deployment of celebrity brand authority as a substitute for gaming industry operational expertise in the management of a major casino acquisition. Griffin had the financial resources and the entertainment industry relationships to pursue the Resorts International acquisition. He did not have James Crosby's regulatory relationships with the New Jersey Casino Control Commission, whose assessment of a new major casino owner's suitability involved a licensing process that examined financial history, business judgment, and gaming industry experience. He did not have the operational experience in casino management that distinguished the Atlantic City properties that were performing well in the early 1990s from those that were struggling. And he did not have the institutional knowledge of the Atlantic City market-specific competitive dynamics that a decade of operation under the founder's direct supervision had produced in the company's management team. The institutional denial embedded in Griffin's management of Resorts International was not the denial of financial reality. In the manner of the Trump Taj Mahal case, Griffin's team was aware of the company's financial difficulties. The denial was the continued belief, sustained through the years of operating difficulty that preceded the 1994 filing, that the entertainment industry relationships and the celebrity brand authority that Griffin brought to the company were competitive assets in the Atlantic City casino market that would eventually produce the revenue required to service the acquisition debt. Those assets were real in the entertainment industry. They were not transferable to the Atlantic City casino market in the way that the acquisition thesis had assumed. The Atlantic City casino customer of 1990 was not choosing a casino based on its owner's celebrity. They were choosing based on gaming floor quality, hotel rates, complimentary services, and the accumulated customer relationship data that the total rewards model that Harrah's was developing would eventually formalize into the competitive weapon that reshaped the entire industry. Griffin's celebrity was a media asset. It was not a customer acquisition asset in the market that Atlantic City had become by 1990. The resort's international property on the Atlantic City Boardwalk has had multiple subsequent ownership structures following the Griffin-era bankruptcy, each of which has attempted to reposition the asset for the Atlantic City market conditions of its respective era. The property operated under various flags and ownership structures through the 1990s and 2010s, a period during which the Atlantic City market experienced the simultaneous expansion and eventual collapse documented in Case File 019. The original resort's international building, the former Haddon Hall Hotel that James Crosby had identified as the optimal location for the first Atlantic City casino in 1978, has survived as a physical structure through multiple ownership cycles and market conditions that have eliminated many of its contemporaries. What the resort's international case reveals in the context of this channel's 37-case archive is the specific vulnerability that founder-dependent companies face in succession events, and the compounding effect that a poorly managed succession produces when it coincides with a peak cycle acquisition at prices the subsequent market cannot validate. The first failure was the governance failure. Crosby's death, without an adequate succession plan that could have resolved the competing interests without the public contest that damaged the company's relationships, its regulatory standing, and its institutional focus during the years when the Atlantic City market required strategic clarity. The second failure was the appraisal failure. Griffin's acquisition at a price that reflected the bullish peak cycle assessment of the Atlantic City market and that the recessionary conditions of the early 1990s made unsustainable. Neither failure was inevitable. A succession plan that had identified a successor with Crosby's combination of regulatory credibility and operational knowledge would have allowed the company to evaluate the Griffin proposal on its strategic merits rather than as the resolution of a governance vacuum. An acquisition price calibrated to a realistic stress scenario for the Atlantic City market would have produced a debt structure that the property's actual revenue generation could have serviced through the early 1990s recession. The first East Coast casino is still operating on the Atlantic City Boardwalk in some form. The company that built it, and the succession dispute that destroyed it, are documented in the regulatory filings and court records of the New Jersey Casino Control Commission. If this case file changed how you evaluate the relationship between founder dependency and institutional durability in family-controlled gaming companies, subscribe because the next case examines what happens when the governance failure is not a succession dispute, but a leverage decision that a market never validates. And in the comments, given Crosby's documented failure to establish a succession plan adequate to prevent the governance dispute that followed his death, what specific corporate governance mechanism should family-controlled gaming companies be required to implement to protect institutional continuity in succession events? The case file is open.